What does it take to forge a legend? Is it born in the halls of power, amidst silk and gold? Or is it forged in chaos, tempered by fire? And hammered into shape on the anvil of crisis? Imagine a kingdom at the heart of Europe. A crossroads of empires, on the very brink of collapse. And this is the story of the Kingdom of Hungary in the mid-15th century. A land bleeding from 1,000 cuts. From the south, the shadow of the crescent moon lengthens as the mighty Ottoman Empire, fresh from its conquest of Constantinople, presses relentlessly north. From the west, the Holy Roman Emperor plots, holding the kingdom's sacred crown hostage. And from within a viper's nest of scheming nobles, each clawing for their own piece of a dying kingdom, while the throne itself stands empty and cold. This is a nation without a shield, a people without a king, a future without hope. And then, from the depths of this turmoil, emerges a boy, an NOT, a prince born to the purple, not an heir coddled in luxury, but the son of a soldier, a child of the frontier. A young man educated in the new, radical ideals of the Renaissance. Raised on the epic stories of ancient Rome. Schooled in the brutal arts of the sword. And destined for something far greater than anyone could have imagined. That boy would become Matthias Corvinus, the Raven King. Under his rule, Hungary would not just survive. It would rise from the ashes of instability to become a shining beacon of the Renaissance, a military, political, and cultural powerhouse feared and respected across the continent. This transformation required more than a brilliant king. It required a new kind of weapon, an army forged in the king's own image, disciplined, professional, relentless, and loyal to no one but the crown. It would be known to history as the Black Army. Did a teenage prisoner become one of Europe's greatest kings? And how did he build the most feared fighting force of his age? Today, we tell the story of Matthias's impossible rise and the birth of the Black Army. Part 1. The bulwark of Christendom MTO, understand the man. We must first understand the world that made him. The Hungary of the 1450s was a kingdom living on a knife's edge. For centuries, it had been a major power in Central Europe, but the ground was shifting beneath its feet. The old medieval order was crumbling, and new, terrifying forces were on the rise. The most terrifying of all was the Ottoman Empire. In 1453, a year that sent a shockwave through the entire Christian world, Sultan Mehmed II, the Conqueror, did the unthinkable. He breached the legendary walls of Constantinople, ending the 1,000-year reign of the Byzantine Empire. The great city, the bastion of Eastern Christendom, was now Istanbul, the capital of a triumphant and seemingly unstoppable Islamic empire. This wasn't a distant event. It was a death knell at their doorstep. The Ottoman armies now controlled the Balkans, and Hungary's southern border became the front line in a holy war. Pope Calixtus III declared Hungary the bulwark of Christendom, the shield that protected Vienna, Rome, and the rest of Europe from the Turkish advance. It was a noble title, but it was also a curse, promising endless war, bloodshed, and sacrifice. Yet, as the wolf scratched at the door, the shepherds were fighting amongst themselves. The internal state of Hungary was one of near anarchy. The kingdom was technically an elective monarchy, where the powerful nobles, the magnates, gathered at a parliament called the Diet to choose their king. In practice, this meant the crown was a toy for the wealthiest families, the Garay, the Sillies, the Salagas, to fight over. They wanted a king weak enough to be controlled, but strong enough to lead armies that they themselves would often refuse to fund or support. Throne had become a revolving door of tragedy and incompetence. King Albert II died of dysentery on campaign. His successor, Władysław III, was killed at the disastrous Battle of Varna. Now the crown belonged to a boy king, Ladislaus the Posthumous, who ruled from the safety of Vienna and Prague, leaving Hungary to be managed by its feuding warlords. In this vacuum of leadership, one man had stood as a giant, John Hunyadi. The White Knight born to a lesser noble family, Hunyadi was a military genius who had risen through sheer talent and force of will to become the voivode of Transylvania and the regent governor of Hungary. For 2 decades, he was the kingdom's sword and shield, the one man the Ottomans truly feared. His life culminated in his greatest victory, the Siege of Belgrade in 1456. And against overwhelming odds, Hunyadi's Crusader army, composed of professional soldiers and peasant volunteers, smashed the elite forces of Mehmed the Conqueror himself, forcing the Sultan to retreat in disgrace. It was a victory so monumental that, to this day, the noon bell rings in Catholic churches worldwide to commemorate the moment Christendom was saved. Hungary and all of Europe rejoiced, but their celebration was short-lived. Just 3 weeks after his triumph, John Hunyadi, the nation's savior, was struck down not by a Turkish blade, but by the plague that swept through his camp. With his death, Hungary's shield was shattered. A power vacuum opened, and into it rushed all the greed, ambition, and violence that Hunyadi had held at bay. But the great defender left behind a legacy. 2 sons, Ladislaus and the younger Matthias. One was destined for the executioner's block, the other for the throne. Part 2. The scholar and the hostage in Matthias Corvinus was born in 1443 in the bustling, multicultural city of Kolozsvár in Transylvania, today Cluj-Napoca in Romania. He was not raised like the pampered heirs of the Habsburgs or Valois. His home was a military camp as much as it was a castle. His father, John Hunyadi, was a man of war, but his mother, Erzsébet Szilágyi, hailed from one of Hungary's most powerful noble families. She ensured her son would wield the pen as skillfully as the sword. While other young nobles focused solely on jousting and hunting, Matthias was immersed in the intellectual revolution sweeping up from Italy, humanism. His tutor was the brilliant Croatian humanist, Jan Vitez. Under his guidance, Matthias devoured the classics. He studied Latin, learning to speak it with such fluency that Italian envoys would later marvel. He read the histories of Caesar and Alexander the Great, the philosophy of Plato, and the new theories of military science and statecraft. He was being molded into a new kind of leader, a Renaissance prince, a philosopher king who understood that knowledge was the ultimate weapon. His childhood of learning was violently interrupted by the bloody game of politics. After John Hunyadi's death, the family's immense power and popularity became a threat to their rivals. The chief antagonist was Ulrich of Chile, a cousin of the young King Ladislaus and the de facto ruler of Hungary. He saw the Hunyadi boys as obstacles to his own ambition. A confrontation was inevitable. In 1456, a plot was hatched. Ulrich of Chile confronted Matthias's older brother, Ladislaus Hunyadi, at Belgrade. Words turned to accusations, and accusations turned to drawn swords. In the ensuing brawl, Ulrich of Chile was cut down and killed by Ladislaus's men. For King Ladislaus the Posthumous, this was an act of high treason. He lured the Hunyadi brothers to the capital, Buda, with promises of reconciliation. It was a trap. In March 1457, Ladislaus Hunyadi was arrested and, after a sham trial, sentenced to death. The execution was a gruesome spectacle. The executioner bungled the job, striking him 3 times without severing his head. According to Hungarian law, if a nobleman survived 3 blows, he was to be pardoned. But the king's guards showed no mercy, finishing the bloody work. The heir to the Hunyadi legacy was dead, and 14-year-old Matthias? He was seized. A boy, his father dead, his brother just executed, now a political prisoner. He was taken to Vienna and then to Prague, held hostage by George of Podobrady, the regent of Bohemia. NHI's life hung by a thread. Imprisoned in a foreign land, his family's name disgraced, his future looked like nothing more than a dark, lonely cell. He had every reason to despair. But in that Prague prison, Matthias was still learning. He watched his captor, the shrewd and pragmatic George of Podobrady, and learned the art of diplomacy and survival firsthand. His crucible was just beginning, and then fate, in its brutal and unpredictable way, intervened. Part 3. The King on the Ice. In November 1457, the unthinkable happened again. King Ladislaus the Posthumous, just 17 years old, suddenly fell ill and died in Prague. Rumors of poison spread like wildfire, though modern historians believe he likely succumbed to leukemia. His death threw the Kingdom of Hungary into absolute chaos. There was no heir. The throne was vacant. The Hungarian magnates scrambled. They needed a new king, and they needed one fast. The Ottomans were probing the borders again. The kingdom was financially ruined. They needed a leader. But they were deeply divided. Some favored the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick III. Others looked to the King of Poland. NBUT-1 faction, led by Matthias's formidable uncle, Mihaly Szilágyi, saw its chance. The Hunyadi name still commanded immense loyalty, especially among the lesser nobility and the common people who revered John Hunyadi as a saint. Szilágyi began a masterful political campaign, rallying support for his imprisoned nephew. His argument was clever. The boy was young, supposedly malleable. The great magnates thought they could control him. And so, the stage was set for one of the most iconic scenes in Hungarian history. On January 24, 1458, the Diet of Hungary convened. But not in a stuffy castle hall. They gathered on the thick ice of the frozen Danube River, separating the twin cities of Buda and Pest. On one side stood the great lords, clad in fur and velvet, debating the fate of the nation. On the other side, in Pest, stood Mihaly Szilágyi, and with him, an army of 15,000 armed men, soldiers loyal to the Hunyadi family. It was an election, but it was also a show of force. As the nobles argued, a murmur grew from the crowds of commoners gathered on the banks. Soon it became a chant, echoing across the frozen river. Matthias, Matthias, we want Matthias. The will of the people, backed by Szilágyi's steel, was undeniable. The magnates relented. There, on the ice of the Danube, the 15-year-old prisoner Matthias Corvinus was elected King of Hungary. It was a moment of incredible destiny. A boy king, chosen while locked in a foreign prison, without a crown, without freedom, without any certainty of what tomorrow would bring. His kingdom was bankrupt, his nobles were treacherous, and 2 powerful empires wished for his failure. The odds were impossible, but Matthias was about to show Europe that he was no one's puppet. Part 4. Taming the vipers and being elected king and actually ruling as one are 2 very different things. The young Matthias returned to Hungary, not as a triumphant hero, but as a king on probation. His uncle, Mihaly Szilágyi, was appointed regent for a 5-year term, intending to rule through his nephew. Rival nobles, who had only elected Matthias as the lesser of several evils, immediately began plotting against him. To the west, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick III not only refused to recognize his election, but held the single most important symbol of Hungarian sovereignty, the Holy Crown of Saint Stephen. Without a coronation with that specific crown, Matthias's legitimacy was constantly in question. A group of disgruntled nobles even elected Frederick as a rival anti-king. Matthias was surrounded by enemies. But he possessed two crucial assets his father had given him: a brilliant mind and a ruthless pragmatism. First, he dealt with his former captor. In a masterful stroke of diplomacy, he negotiated his own release by agreeing to marry the daughter of George of Pontebray, Catherine. This secured his freedom and turned Bohemia from a potential enemy into a vital ally. Next, he turned his attention to his own overbearing uncle. Within 2 years, through shrewd political maneuvering and by building his own loyal court, Matthias completely sidelined Szilágy, forcing him out of the regency and taking the full reins of power into his own hands. He was barely 17 years old. He then moved to tackle the fundamental problem that had plagued Hungary for decades: the crown's complete dependence on the feudal magnates. Kings before him had to beg the Diet for money and soldiers, which were often withheld as a political weapon. Matthias knew that to be a true king, he needed his own money and his own army. NHE launched a series of sweeping financial reforms. He introduced a new unified royal tax called the treasure tax, which was levied on all households, bypassing many of the exemptions the nobles had enjoyed. He reformed the currency and took control of the kingdom's lucrative mines. These moves were deeply unpopular with the elites who had their privileges curtailed, but they were revolutionary. For the first time in generations, the Hungarian crown had a steady, independent, and enormous income. He coupled this with legal reforms, centralizing the justice system and often traveling his kingdom in disguise, or so the legends say, to hear the complaints of the common people and dispense justice personally. He was building a base of power that rested not just on the fickle loyalty of the aristocracy, but on the support of the nation itself. NHE had tamed the vipers at home. He had filled his treasury. Now he needed a sword. He looked at the feudal levies, the armies of nobles who were slow to muster, ill-disciplined, and fought for personal glory, and saw only weakness. Hungary, the bulwark of Christendom, could not survive with an army of the past. It needed an army of the future. An army that was permanent, professional, paid for by the crown, and loyal only to the king. This vision would soon give birth to the Black Army. Part 5. The symbol of the raven, NBUT. Before we speak more of this legendary army, we must ask, why was he called the Raven King? The answer is rooted in his family's identity. The Hunyadi coat of arms features a black raven, a corvus in Latin, clutching a golden ring in its beak. From this, Matthias adopted the Latin name Corvinus, but a legend quickly grew around the symbol. One story tells of a time when a raven stole a ring from the young Matthias. He hunted the bird down, shot it with his bow, and recovered his property. His father, John Hunyadi, was so impressed by his son's tenacity that he made the raven the family's sigil, a reminder that what is yours must be fought for and reclaimed. The raven became Matthias's personal brand. It was a perfect symbol: dark, intelligent, observant, and opportunistic. It represented a king who saw everything, who was patient but struck with deadly precision. Over time, the raven would come to represent not just the king, but the disciplined, relentless army he was about to create. And this king was far more than just a warrior. Matthias Corvinus was a true Renaissance man. His passion for learning was insatiable. He poured his newfound wealth into culture and science, determined to transform his capital of Buda into a beacon of learning that would rival Florence or Rome. He created one of the greatest libraries in all of world history, the Bibliotheca Corviniana. He sent agents across Italy and the former Byzantine Empire to hunt down and purchase or copy every significant Greek and Roman text they could find. His library grew to over 2,500 volumes, an astronomical number in the age before the printing press. Each was a masterpiece of scholarship and art, bound in leather and velvet, exquisitely illuminated by hand. In all of Europe, only the Vatican Library was its peer. NHE invited Italian architects, artists, and scholars to his court, rebuilding Buda Castle into a magnificent Renaissance palace. He established an academy, sponsored astronomers, and debated philosophy late into the night with the sharpest minds of his age. He was the embodiment of the new era, a ruler who understood that true power lay not only in armies and gold, but in knowledge, culture, and ideas. He was both the sword and the book, the warrior and the scholar, the raven and the crown. Part 6. The Road Ahead. NBY, the early 1460s, the pieces were in place. The boy who had been a hostage was now the undisputed master of his kingdom. Matthias Corvinus had stabilized Hungary's finances. He had brought the rebellious nobles to heel. He had secured his borders through shrewd diplomacy. After years of negotiation and a hefty ransom paid to Frederick III, he had even recovered the Holy Crown of St. Stephen, finally holding his official coronation in 1464, solidifying his legitimacy beyond all doubt. The kingdom was secure. The treasury was full. The king's authority was absolute. Now it was time to forge the weapon that would define his reign. To the west, the fractured Holy Roman Empire remained a persistent rival. To the south, Sultan Mehmed II, having consolidated his power, was once again turning his gaze toward the Danube. The threat was constant and existential. And so, within his own kingdom, Matthias began to recruit, not from the Hungarian nobility, but from the battle-hardened mercenaries of Europe. Battle-scarred Bohemian infantry, masters of the wagon fort, heavily armored German and Polish knights, Italian firearms experts, and Serbian light cavalry. He offered them something they craved more than glory: good, reliable pay, straight from the king's treasury. He was assembling a revolutionary force, a black tide of professional soldiers who owed their allegiance to no lord, no banner, no nation, only to the golden florins of the Raven King. The boy who was once a prisoner was now a king forging his destiny. He had brought order from chaos. Next, he would forge an army. In our next episode, we witness the birth of this legendary army. We will see how Matthias organized it, armed it, and unleashed it upon his enemies. An army that marched under the banner of the Raven. An army that would change the face of warfare in Europe. An army that would earn its fearsome name, the Black Army of Hungary. And this is the story of Matthias Corvinus, and his rise is only the beginning.